Hey guys, Mike from the WCA with the final update from the fall 2013 session. Thank you all very much for coming out, and we look forward to seeing you guys in January. Hopefully you can all make it back, so keep an eye out in your inbox for the dates. Okay, want to show you something today that's really interesting and also very important to learn, and it's the idea of recognizing patterns and ideas in games, patterns that you've learned that the first time you see them might seem a little advanced or sound a little odd when you first learn about them, but once you really master them and start using them in your games, a very interesting thing will happen to you. You'll start seeing these new patterns and new ideas hiding in positions that at first glance they're not obvious at all, but with a little bit of calculation and some work, you can sometimes turn the position that's in front of you into something that's really well known but kind of hidden at the beginning. So I'm going to do this in reverse. First I'm going to show you this position where the tool or the idea that we're going to talk about is obvious. And the idea is basically this: two pawns that are connected, as you see here in this position for white, when they reach the 6th rank, they can very often overpower a rook, because mathematically, or in terms of material, if we look at the position here, black is up a couple of points, right? I mean, black has a rook and 3 pawns, which is 8 points, and white here has 6 pawns. So black is technically up 2 points of power, or 2 points of material. The problem for black is, after the move h6, and I'm going to highlight the pawns, you'll see the connected pawns side by side on the 6th rank fighting against a rook. Those pawns are, in this position, they're unstoppable, but in many positions it's difficult for a rook to stop them. And if you spend a little time looking at the position, you'll realize why. Here, there's really not much that black can do. They can try a move like rook g8 to, fight the pawns from the front. Not going to work. You can just play a move like g7, and no matter what black does, your next move is going to be pawn to h7. So, for example, if they play something like a5, you just play h7, and the rook is powerless. You're going to promote one of these pawns. So if they take, you just queen the pawn, and now this position is turned into something like this: 2 pawns versus a rook, to this, which is now queen against rook, and this is totally winning for white. There's nothing black can do to stop you. If they try to get your pawn, you can just support that pawn with your queen, or tactically in this position you can even start to push it to promote a second queen, and if black took, you can just pin the rook, and you'll play this game with an extra queen. So that's an easy win, right? So in your mind, I want you to remember this position: the 2 pawns working side by side, and they're not just worth 2 points. Obviously, together, helping each other, and the fact that they're pushed further up the board makes them more than 2 points. So in this case, they were able to overpower a whole rook. Okay, I want you to compare that to this position, and it's going to take a moment or two for your eyes to get adjusted, because I flipped the board. Here you're playing the black pieces, and if you did a very fast set position analysis, you'll see the material is equal. Each team has a rook, each team has a minor piece. There's 4 pawns for each side, and there are some major differences. Here the minor pieces are different. It's a battle of knight versus bishop. The rooks are both placed pretty well. They're on their opponent's 7th rank, which is a great spot for rooks to attack the pawns from the side. The kings will eventually get into the battle at some point. This is an endgame where the primary purpose is to promote a pawn. So all of you guys should know by now that your king needs to work. The knight and bishop both look kind of odd. The bishop is kind of hemmed in by his own pawns, and the knight's on the side of the board. So when you first look at that, it looks like both of these players kind of got their minor pieces tied up, but there were reasons why they're there. Remember, we didn't see the whole game, the opening and in the middle game. You're looking at this set position. However, and this is just an amazing position, Here, the player with the black pieces saw deep inside this position the idea that his pawns could actually overpower the two white pieces, the rook and the knight. And you can't imagine finding moves like this unless you've seen the idea before. We got this position from a book, a gentleman named Angus Dunnington, who wrote a whole book about pawns, about structure and pawn promotion. Really terrific book. And this was the first position in there. And this is a game between two masters. So what happens is somehow the player with black was able to turn this position into a position where the pawns become incredibly powerful. And the only way to do that is to actually sacrifice the rook. So the first move from this position was rook takes b2. Now that's a whole rook sitting there on b2 that can be taken by the knight. If you don't take the rook, there aren't many great alternatives for white here. So let's go through them slowly. And I recommend that you guys pause your video as many times as you need to make sure that you can follow along. Okay, so let's look at some lines here. We're going to look at taking the rook last, which was the continuation in the game. So let's look at this first. Let's look at knight takes b6. If you take the bishop off, then what will happen is black is going to take you back, and it's now become rook on rook, and white's problem is this c-pawn that I'm circling here is going to be impossible to stop. You can try to, I don't want to do that, pardon me. You can try to move your rook here to protect your pawn on a2, but black is simply going to push the c-pawn, and that's unstoppable. So that's clearly not going to work. So let's go back to the rook taking the pawn. What else can they do? They can try knight c3. And knight c3 is going to be met by rook c2, just attacking the knight, and wherever it goes, that front c-pawn again is going to start to run, and white's going to have to give up material to stop that. So that's not going to work. So what to do? One idea that white could have tried that looks bad on the surface, but it contains a little bit of a trap. What white can try to do in this position is take the bishop with the rook. And by doing that, you're setting a little bit of a trap. And you have to be very, very careful here as black. If you take the rook like this, if you trade your rook, your thinking might be, well, if they take my rook, my best move is to just take their knight. I'm now up a pawn. I have two passed pawns, even though they're isolated. This has to be winning. And you do have an advantage here, but I want to caution you about something. If you start playing moves like, well, white's move is actually forced. White is going to have to get their king in the zone to be able to stop that pawn. And then black should probably follow up with a move like b5. Black still has a big advantage here, but it's not as easy as what could have happened in the game. Let me show you something else. After white plays the move king f2, it's very common for players to think, well, my pawns aren't being attacked. Let me get my king involved. And you play a move like king g6. And then white throws the move a4 in. And the idea of a4 is just to stop your pawn on b6 from moving. And all of a sudden, you went from a position that was totally winning to one that you really have to still put a lot of work into to win. You know, these king and pawn endings can be funny. One little slip and your opponent is back in the game. So let's go back here to this idea of trading. If white takes your rook, the winning move here is not to take the knight. It's simply just to push the pawn to c3. And by doing that, the knight is out of position to catch the pawn. The problems with knights are, unless they can move and check your king and kind of steal a move away from you that way, they can only move to one color attacking the opposite color. And it's a very simple pattern when knights try to catch pawns. If they can't stay on the right color, they're never going to catch the pawn. And you can just see here with some simple calculation that white cannot catch that pawn. And I want to show you something else here, and that's this box. We already know the knight can't catch the pawn, and the highlighted squares that you see up there is known as the square of the pawn. And that is basically a square you create by moving your eyes diagonally from the pawn until you get to the edge of the board, and then just come back up and make this square. And the rule of the square basically says if the king you're playing against can get inside that square, he can catch your pawn. So in this position, you guys should see that the white king cannot get inside that box, so the pawn is unstoppable. You would queen and have a winning position. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back up here to after black first sacrificed that rook. White, realizing that in this position those other lines didn't work, accepted the sacrifice, and by doing so, black then has to ask himself the question, hey, I just gave up a whole rook. What's the idea? So maybe you can pause your video, and if you need to, and see if you can follow through. Okay, so here comes black's idea. It's the pawn move c3. And with c3, black is attacking the knight, but it's a funny thing about pawns. When they get close to the edge of the board to promotion, if it turns out that they're attacking a piece on one of those lines, then remember the pawn has two options of how to move. So in this particular position, the pawn could try to promote two different ways. It could take the knight, or it could just move forward to c2, and that becomes an issue for white in this position. So what do you do here? You have to be able to stop that pawn. So let's go through a couple of the options. The obvious move is to move your knight to d3, and by moving it to d3, you appear to be on the right square to stop the pawn from promoting at the top of the board, but the move knight d3 runs into this pretty cool check. And by checking the king, you're simultaneously attacking the knight with the second c-pawn, with the c-pawn that's in the back. This is actually just a fascinating position. So now the ball is back in white's court. What's white to do here? Let's go through these options one at a time. To get out of check, let's look at just moving the king to f1. King to f1, now you start to see what this master was looking at when we first showed you the position. They're going to play the move c takes d3. And that should look familiar to you guys. There are the two pawns side by side on the 6th rank that can very often overpower a rook. Here the pawns have to not only overpower the rook, but they also have to be able to stop the king from preventing them from promoting. But it's pretty easy. If the king moves to e1, you just play bishop to e3, and after bishop to e3, your c-pawn is just going to run, and there's no way for white to stop that. Okay, so let's get back to this check. So after the check, moving the knight, moving the king's not going to work. So what else does white try here? All right, let's look at the move knight f2. And this is probably the worst idea, because by playing knight f2, you just walk right into a pin, and then pawn c2 is threatening promotion with mate, actually, and there's no way to stop that. So knight f2 is clearly not going to work. Okay, that leaves us with the move rook takes b6, which is the game continuation. All right, so I apologize. Let's look at this for one more. I forgot one line for you guys. After knight d3, after c4, this is the move, I'm sorry. White's best move is to play rook takes b6. And this is real important at this point that you guys stop the video if you need to. When white takes that bishop, it's kind of a funny position. You have two different ways, or two different white pieces that you can capture in this position. And if you're just playing by your intuition or by what feels right, you could actually lose this game very easily. So the most natural thing to do here is to take the more valuable piece, right? So, why not take the rook in this position? If you take the rook, you're going to wind up in trouble, because by taking the rook, you're going to allow white to play this cool move, knight b4. And knight b4 is a blockading move. It's stopping the c pawn from being protected from this b pawn down here. So here, black would love to be able to advance this pawn all the way up the board to support the running pawn up at here, but there's no time. The knight gets in the way, and if you start to play typical endgame moves, for example, king g6, bring your king out, king f5. This would be all very natural and easy moves to play. White would play king e3, and you can start to support your pawn chain with something like b5, but then after king d4, white is in position to start taking your pawns. So a common defensive idea is to play moves like c2. That'll pull the knight away from the action a little bit, and then advance your king, hoping to be able to penetrate and maybe take some of white's pawns on the other side. The problem is white will play a move like king c3, and they'll leave this setup for a while and force black to make moves that don't help their position. The advanced players would know that as zugzwang. So let me show you what I mean. Those highlighted squares are actually all under white's control. The king, the knight, and the two pawns make this barrier or this fence that the black king cannot cross because of check. And there's really no way for black to make progress here, and it's only a matter of time before white takes the pawns and wins the game. So that's what would happen if you were to take the rook. You'd have to be very, very careful here. So on rook takes b6, the correct move again, and this is all thematic, by now you guys should have figured out the correct move. It's you don't take the rook, you take the knight. And there are your two connected passed pawns at the top of the board again, and this is a winning position for black. Okay, so after all of that, and again, please go back and review this as many times as you want, because it's complicated, but it all flows nicely, and there's really not much that white could have done. So let's go back to the original capture, and I'll show you the game continuation. So white accepts the sacrifice, black plays the move c3, and white takes the bishop. By taking the bishop, he's setting a trap. Now, what's the trap? Your first impression is, I can take either one of these pieces, and I probably should. And if I take either one of these pieces, I'm going to be winning. Well, that's not true. Without moving the pieces, you should clearly see that taking the knight at the top of the board loses. The rook will just take back, and that there's no way to move your pawns. You're going to be down a rook. Game is over. Okay, so if I can't take the knight, then the question is, can I take the rook? And you guys can stop the board, stop the video and go through that. Well, we can't take the rook either, as it turns out. If you take the rook, you're going to run into the same blockade that you ran into in the other position. White is going to play knight to d3, and no matter how you set up your pawns, white is going to be able to defend them. If you play c2, for example, white's going to get the king into the battle. c4, you'll force the knight to the back rank, but the problem is after b5, white just plays a3, and you're not able to get your pawns running. Your king is too far away, and white is actually going to win this game. Okay, so back to the game continuation. If you're not going to take either piece, it's absolutely amazing how black played from here, but black finds the move pawn to c4, and at this very moment they're actually down a rook and a knight, and it's white who's in a lot of trouble. What can white do in this position? Okay, let's try to figure this out. If you play, this is the game continuation. This is rook to b4, and we'll show you what that does in a moment. It's basically getting out of the way of the pawn, but at the same time attacking one of black's pawns. But if you don't take it, what to do? You can try taking the c pawn, the backward pawn, with the knight, but then just c2, and it's amazing how that pawn is just unstoppable. The rook can't get to the back rank to stop it, so that's not going to work. What else can we do? Well, we can try knight to d3. If you play knight to d3, we simply take, and there's our old friend again, and you saw how that's going to end, or at least you guys should know how that ends. So in the game, white plays the move rook to b4, trying to just get a hold of these pawns, take them off one by one, and here black just shows the power of these pawns. Just another amazing move. He plays the move pawn a5, and it's just such a cool move, because what do? If you take, as in the game, now black simply takes the knight, and look at the two black pawns on the right side of the board. They're protecting each other from the rook. There is no way for that rook to stop one of those pawns, to stop that b pawn from queening. So that's not going to work. So after a5, if you don't take with the rook, you can try here knight a4, and that's just going to run into pawn takes, and here the forward pawn on c3 is just impossible to stop. So what I'd like you to do is go through this again if you have the time. I know it's time consuming, but if you set this position up on a chessboard and went through some of these moves yourself, you would find this is just a fascinating position. And spending the time doing it, I can guarantee you that you will really begin to master the idea of turning your pawns into more than just pawns. They actually become pieces when they work together and get close to queening. Okay, guys.